Sup, Zaz here. So I'm going to do my best here to try to explain the different settings on a compressor. I'm going to try my best to keep this as short as possible. I'm also going to use various audio and visual elements to help demonstrate all these different settings as well. Good friend of mine, the Frugal Streamer, has a video in the works that you can check out before you watch this video if you want to get a more simplistic understanding of how a compressor works. I trust that he's going to do a very good job of that, so make sure you go keep an eye out for that. I will also link it in the description below. I will also provide timestamps and whatnot if you want to just skip around to the stuff that you want to know about. And then at the end, I'm going to give you some of my own personal recommendations for different settings you could use. And I'm going to apply this specifically to streaming and voiceovers. So maybe for like, you know, sound designers or musicians, this will still be helpful to some degree, but it might not give you all the information that you need for what your specific application is. So now we got all the formalities out of the way, why don't we go ahead and get right into it. First and foremost, really quickly, a compressor is simply a plugin that will dynamically adjust the volume of whatever input source you put into it, and it will do so depending on the settings that you have set on it. It's basically the equivalent to somebody taking like a slider on a mixer, right, and adjusting the volume as it's going. You can see I'm moving the slider up and down with my finger over here. And the settings will adjust the action of that depending on how you have them set. And the main way that it does this is through a process called gain reduction. Gain reduction, simply put, is just your volume of your source getting lowered from what it originally was. If you've ever used OBS before, you might have seen the gain plugin. All the gain plugin does is that it'll allow you to put a flat boost or a flat reduction on the gain across the entire source. What the compressor doing here isn't necessarily that. It's actually looking at what the audio is, and it's bringing the volume down based on like how loud it is going into it. So that way you can help maintain some of the dynamics from the source while also maybe bringing certain things up to a point that is closer to your louder sources. This will make a lot more sense when we get later into it. I'm going to be using gain reduction a lot through this tutorial, so as long as we have that established, you know, gain reduction is just the volumes of the source just being lowered. That's all that is. A lot of the times I'll recommend the Reaper plugins for people to use in OBS. One of the main reasons is because it has a visual element that will allow you to see how much gain reduction is being applied to your source. It just speeds up the process so that you don't have to keep going back and forth doing recordings. It just makes it a lot easier to have some kind of reference when you're making adjustments to settings. So by any means, don't feel like I'm telling you to just use the Reaper plugins. Like, it's just one of my recommendations for most people. By all means, feel free to experiment with different compressors, so they all typically have something to bring to the table. I'm gonna get started with the threshold. Okay, so the threshold is like one of the main things you have to set on the compressor. Basically, the threshold tells the compressor at which point that should start applying gain reduction. Any audio that is louder than the specified threshold has its volume reduced. And if you look at this waveform here, if I was to draw a line at where the threshold point is, basically everything above that line is what's gonna get its volume reduced. This setting in particular is something you're probably gonna need to, you know, mess around with, as it's gonna depend entirely on how loud the source is going into your compressor. Everybody kind of sets their mic gain a little differently, so make sure you get that sort of established before you start playing around with stuff. So just to kind of sum up what the threshold does, it's kind of just like the point where you tell the compressor, hey, start doing your thing. Anything below that will not get affected by the compressor whatsoever, in theory. Next, we got the ratio. So this one's a little more complex to talk about, but it's actually a lot more simplistic than I'll probably make it sound at this moment. I'm doing my best here. Basically, the ratio adjusts the gain of the source based on how high above the threshold the audio goes. Basically, the higher that you set the ratio, the more gain reduction that will happen. And it's not like a flat ratio. Let's say you have two pieces of audio. One goes 5 decibels above the threshold. The other one goes about 1 decibel above the threshold. The 5 decibel peak will have its volume reduced more than the 1 decibel one. That's because it's a ratio. It's not a flat value. This is what I was talking about in regards to the dynamic adjustment. I could literally make a video on this. There's like a formula behind it and everything, but it's really not that important. You just need to understand the concept of it. Basically, the higher you set the ratio, the more gain reduction you get and the more compressed the audio will sound. Some compressors will actually let you set an infinite ratio, and that basically turns the compressor into a limiter, which just puts a hard cutoff at that point where you set the threshold. The audio will not go past the threshold, in theory. There's a caveat to that, but in general, you should just assume that if you have an infinite ratio set, it'll be limiting. And again, for brevity's sake, we're not going to go too deep into that today. Throughout this video, I'm going to be using a piano sample to demonstrate the compression effects, as it can be a bit difficult sometimes to tell what the effects are with some vocals. I felt that the piano sample did a better job of showing it. So if you'd like me to do something more specific towards vocals in the future, let me know in the comments down below. Next, I want to talk about the makeup gain. This setting will apply more or less gain to the signal after it's compressed. Since compression is lowering the volume of your source dynamically, you're going to lose loudness from the source as a result of compression. applying makeup gain will make up for that lost volume. Towards the end of the video, where I give my tips, I'm going to give you some more advice on how you should go about approaching makeup gain. There's a bunch of different ways you can use it, but there are some really useful ways that you can also use makeup gain to kind of tell whether or not your settings are good. All right, now we're going to kind of get into more of the niche settings with the compressor. I'm going to do my best here to try to demonstrate how these things work, but basically these next settings will adjust the action of the compressor itself. If you go back to my analogy of a person adjusting the volume of a volume slider, it's not a robotic, instantly snap to exact volume setting sort of thing. It takes some time for me to adjust the setting of the slider going back and forth. And that's basically what these next settings, attack, release, and need do. They allow you to set the amount of time it takes for the compressor to engage and disengage. And this can have a, at first, not noticeable effect on the sound until you run into certain situations. I'm going to start with the attack first. The attack will tell the compressor how quickly in milliseconds it reaches full gain reduction once the input audio exceeds the threshold. A faster attack will make something called transients, which are those sharp spikes that you see in a waveform. They're usually at the beginning of the waveform whenever you, for example, say a bunch of syllables in words. You will see those sharp spikes in the waveform. A faster attack will typically make those transients quieter. So keep in mind when I say faster attack, that's lower milliseconds. So like 1 millisecond would be a really fast attack. A slower attack will make transients louder since it won't apply any gain reduction to that part of the audio, or at least it'll apply it a lot more slowly. And that's usually slow enough that it'll allow the transients to come through before any gain reduction happens. So while technically you're not making those transients louder, contextually you are, because everything after it's getting its volume reduced. The release tells the compressor how quickly in milliseconds to stop applying gain reduction once the audio resides under the threshold. Plain and simple, a faster release will make the gain reduction disengage faster, and a slower release will make the gain reduction sustain for longer. This setting is usually a lot more difficult to demonstrate. It usually takes a longer sound to demonstrate this sort of thing a lot more accurately, but there are certain situations where you might want to make this longer or shorter depending on what sort of audio source you're dealing with. In this case, we're talking about voiceovers. This is probably going to depend largely on how quickly you speak, but we'll get into that shortly. All right, so now we're going to kind of get into sort of the tips and recommendations I might have for most people who are watching this video, who maybe don't know much about compressors at all, and just want some general settings that you can use to get started. I'm going to start with the threshold. I can't really give any general settings for the threshold. This is going to depend entirely on how you have your mic gain staged going into the compressor. So if your mic is generally like pretty quiet going into it, like you're probably going to be setting your threshold way lower than some other people. Whereas if you had it a lot louder, you're not going to need to bring it down as much. It all depends entirely on where you want the compressor to activate. It's going to depend on how you talk. Might even depend on what your language is that you're speaking, because different languages use different consonants and vowels, different sounds and whatnot. So it's one of those things that I would highly recommend that you kind of play around with on your own. Reaper kind of makes it a lot easier. You can see the gain reduction on the right-hand side on that red meter that you see over there. So that's kind of like a good way to figure out whether or not you're actually activating the compressor enough. So in general, when it comes to threshold, just expect to play around with this setting a bit. Now, when it comes to ratio, I can definitely give you a recommendation here. Personally, for voiceover, I like to use anywhere between a 2-to-1 or a 4-to-1 ratio. By no means am I saying that you shouldn't go above or below these things. It's just that in most instances, this setting typically tends to work out pretty well for a lot of people. So anywhere within that 2-to-1 to 4-to-1 range, play around with it, try them out, see which ones you like better. Personally, I use 2-to-1. In some instances, I might use 3, depending on what specifically I'm doing. But for my voice personally and the way I like to present my stream, I use 2-to-1 and it works out pretty well. In regards to the threshold and the ratio, they sort of work interchangeably. The ratio will not work if your threshold is not set at all. So if your threshold is 0 dB, the ratio might not really do anything, especially if your audio is not reaching that 0 dB point. Conversely, if you don't have a ratio set at all, if your ratio is just set to 1-to-1, then it doesn't matter where you set that threshold, your compressor is not going to turn on at all. So when you're setting the threshold and the ratio, keep in mind that you may have to adjust them sort of interchangeably. If you feel like you're not getting enough of the effect, maybe try playing with the threshold first before you adjust the ratio. Conversely, if you have your threshold set really low and you feel like you're not getting enough compression, then try adjusting your ratio, set it up a little higher. The only thing I would keep in mind is that depending on how low you set the threshold, it may affect more elements of your audio than maybe you intend to. So pay pretty close attention to the gain reduction. Make sure you're not affecting more audio than you actually want to. Now we're kind of getting into attack and release here. For most voiceover, I find that an attack setting between 3 milliseconds and 15 milliseconds is usually pretty good. So basically you find that like your transients or your consonant syllables at the beginning of each syllable tend to come in a little too strong for your liking, or if you see that like every time you speak, like you might clip your audio for example, then you might want to consider using a faster attack time. Keep in mind that when I say faster, I mean lower in milliseconds, so closer to like 3 milliseconds. Again, keep in mind this is just a range, you got to play around with it. If you feel like your consonants are coming in too soft though, like you feel like there's just not enough like emphasis on the beginning of your syllables, if it feels like a little too even with the rest of your audio, then you might want to consider using a longer attack time, so closer to 15 milliseconds. I've typically noticed when it comes to speech that like that range, like the smallest adjustments can make a big difference in terms of how much of that consonant comes through. And when I say consonants, I'm talking like P sounds, T sounds, you know, like really sharp sounds tend to come through a lot more. So small adjustments go a long way with this one. For attack, I personally use around 7 milliseconds. So the release is going to depend a lot on the pacing of your speech. Fast talker might want to go with a faster release time than a slow talker would. Basically, if you feel like the compression is starting to bleed into your syllables and is causing your syllables to come through a lot quieter or not as attacky as you would like them to be, then you might want to consider shortening your release time. On the contrary though, if you listen to the compression and it feels a little too pumpy or jarring, like you feel like the volume's coming down too quickly and then coming right back up whenever you speak, then you might want to consider lengthening the release time a bit. This is a really hard thing to hear compression-wise. Hopefully the earlier example kind of demonstrated it pretty well for you. This is also kind of why I had that general rule of if you're a slow talker, then consider a longer release time, usually somewhere in the vicinity of about 100 milliseconds to 150, maybe even 200 milliseconds. And if you're a fast talker, then maybe consider something around like 60 or 80, maybe even up to 100. Personally, I use 80 milliseconds. So if you wanted to just use that setting, you can go ahead and do that. Back to makeup gain. When it comes to makeup gain, I usually set it so that after compression, it'll be around the same peak volume as my original input source. When I say peak volume, I mean the point where the audio is at its loudest. You can usually look at the meter to tell how loud your source is going into the compressor or even coming out of it. Doing this is usually a good way of checking how your compression actually sounds. We tend to perceive louder as better, so volume matching your compressed audio with your original audio is a good way of sort of sanity checking your compression settings. If you make the compressed audio too loud compared to the original source, then it might end up convincing you, for the worse, that your settings are good simply because they are louder than before. So even if it's just for the sake of practice, good practice, I highly recommend that you do that with your makeup gain. Set it so that it just makes up for the amount of volume you lost and match it to your original input audio source peak-wise. Now, after you find that you're happy with your compressor settings, this is the point where you can then use the makeup gain to sort of actually boost the volume of your source. I know this sounds contrary to what I said just a second ago, but there aren't any really hard and fast rules with a lot of these settings. If my compressor allows me to boost the volume of my source going out of it, I'll utilize it. In Reaper's case, they actually have a pretty convenient output meter that you can reference. In this case, on Reaper's plugin, the wet slider is actually the output gain. But in general, I'll usually try to set the makeup gain of the plugin so that my audio source is as loud as it'll get before it starts clipping the audio. And you generally want to avoid clipping the audio because it can lead to distortion that can make your mic potentially unpleasant for your audience to listen to. And of course, there's also a workaround for this. You can put a limiter after your compressor if you really need to. I always put a limiter at the end of my effects chain. In regards to OBS, this will be that filters list that you see for your audio plugins. I put it right at the bottom every single time. And let's just make sure that like I'm not going over that limit that prevents me from clipping going out to the stream. I wish I could give you a setting for your makeup gain that'll work for everybody, but this is largely, like I said, going to depend on how loud your source is. You're gonna have to just sort of meter it and check for yourself to make sure that you're not clipping your signal once it goes out. That just about wraps this video up. I hope you guys found it helpful. If you did, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. I'm not gonna be making too many audio tutorials on this channel specifically. More than likely, I'll be making a separate channel more dedicated to like the audio and music side of what I do. But I found that this would probably be something really helpful for a lot of people who do streaming. So hopefully it reaches you, share it with your friends, and get that sound that you're looking for. Appreciate y'all taking the time to watch this video. Hope you found it helpful, and have a nice day, y'all.